MIDI Mapper is a module that loads into the Data Plugins window. If MIDI Mapper is already open when the MIDI device is connected, the device will not automatically appear in the list of connected devices. Click on the refresh button to make it appear so that you can select it. Next, the mapping operation is done in 2 steps. First, we map the MIDI Mapper to a Logelloop interface. The fader for track 6 is now connected to the MIDI Mapper. The minimum and maximum values for the fader are entered, and the preferred interaction mode, Reach to Modify, is automatically selected. Now let's click on the Learn button, which puts the MIDI Mapper on standby for a signal from the MIDI device. A slight movement of the MIDI potentiometer causes it to be recognized by the MIDI Mapper, which integrates its controller address 52 on MIDI channel 1. We can now control the Logelloop fader using the external potentiometer. Reach to Modify prevents sudden changes in values by only allowing the external device to act on the position of the internal fader when the 2 knobs have matching values. As long as they do not match, the position of the external device's fader is indicated by a phantom knob. Its value must match that of the Logelloop interface for the connection to be effective. Let's change the minimum and maximum values and observe that this reduces the range of the user interface. It is possible to modify the transfer curve between the external interface and the internal interface. If we group the tracks, their 3 faders are now linked. Note that we can still move them individually by clicking on Alt. In Reach to Modify mode, the external button acts simultaneously on the grouped faders. But if we choose Value mode, the external button acts only on the fader of the track to which it is directly assigned. By clicking the G button, we activate group control in Value mode. When we are satisfied with the settings, we can create a memory. Let's do a new Learn to change the MIDI controller and choose a push button. With a push button, in Reach to Modify mode, the action is momentary and the 3 faders are controlled as a group. Pressing the button causes the faders to move to the maximum value, and releasing it returns them to the minimum position. If we choose Value, the action remains momentary but is performed on a single fader. By choosing Toggle, pressing the button causes a persistent switch, and we can apply an interpolation time expressed in milliseconds when switching from one state to another. Now let's choose the List Down mode. Let's enter values in the list. Down means that when the MIDI device button is pressed, the next value in the list will be selected. By choosing List Up, the next item would be selected when the button is released. Here too, an interpolation time can be applied. Now let's map the second channel of MIDI Mapper to the list counter, learn another button on our MIDI controller, and choose Deck from the list of available actions. Each time this new button is pressed, the list counter will decrease. We can now navigate forwards and backwards through the list. If we remove or add items to the list, the maximum value of the counter is automatically updated. If the list contains a single item, This is equivalent to emitting a constant value that will allow us, for example, to return to a default value. Now let's assign our first button to the speed of a looper. In list mode, let's specify several speed values. This allows us to switch between speeds by navigating through the list. Let's add a second looper. Let's copy the loop from the first looper and paste it into the second looper. Let's map the second section of the MIDI mapper to the speed of this new looper. And let's assign it to the same MIDI button as the first section. We can now increment both speed lists simultaneously. If the two counters are out of sync, we can resynchronize them using the R button. We can also change the counter status by selecting the box and using the keyboard arrows or by typing in the value. We can navigate using MIDI buttons in a menu. Let's map the MIDI mapper to the LFO memory menu. Assign two MIDI buttons and select the deck and ink modes. We can now navigate the menu and load LFO presets using our two MIDI buttons. Let's map 4 channels of the MIDI mapper to channels 1 to 4 of the console. Then let's do MIDI learn on 4 potentiometers of our MIDI console. By default, the suggested setting is reach to modify. But since our MIDI console has motorized potentiometers, we prefer feedback mode. Note that the console faders follow the status of those in Logelloop. Let's save these settings. Now let's map the faders for channels 5 to 8, which will be linked to the same potentiometers on the MIDI console. Let's choose feedback mode. Let's create a memory with these new settings. Note that when switching from one memory to another, the external MIDI device takes on the current settings from the Logelloop user interfaces. Let's activate the LFO. The faders 1 to 4 start moving. The external device follows these movements. We can deactivate the feedback without affecting the reception of MIDI signals from the external device, and the MIDI control remains active. The Auto Activate Next MIDI Learn option activates the next MIDI learn after each MIDI learn. Let's activate this option before making a new series of connections to the console's rotary knobs. Note that these knobs also receive feedback from Logelloop. Now let's see how to configure multiple MIDI devices in the same setup. Let's do a whole series of mappings and learns on the first MIDI device. The device we are using here has a different output port name from the input port name. Let's activate the menu displaying the list of devices available for outgoing MIDI connections and select our device from the list. Note that the change in value of an auxiliary send is visible on the external device. Let's save these settings in a memory. Now let's select the second device and make a new set of settings and save them in a new memory. Let's load the previous memory and note that we can switch between devices on the fly. Let's open a second MIDI mapper and load a different memory in each MIDI mapper. This means we can have several MIDI mappers receiving signals from the same MIDI device or from different devices, and we can change the configuration at any time. Some Logelloop interfaces, such as the record buttons on Looper, Corpus, Granular, and Granular T, are sensitive to the length of time they are pressed. A short press triggers recording or playback, while a long press clears the current loop or a recording in progress. In this situation, value mode is the most suitable because it allows the button press time to be calculated. We could also use trigger, which sends a short signal to the record button. Trigger allows you to activate recording and switch to playback. However, long presses are not detected and erasure will never occur. This option may be useful when it is difficult to control the press duration. Now let's configure a second section of the MIDI mapper. Map it to the same record button and the same button on the external interface. Let's choose Trigger Up so that the signal is sent when the external button is released. Record is activated when the button is pressed, and playback starts as soon as the button is released. We have just configured a momentary recording system. In this configuration, we can use another button to clear the loop. If we want the MIDI action to have very high priority, we can activate the flash. This option can sometimes help to record more precise loops. It is best reserved for fast computers, and it is not recommended to use high priority for actions that do not require extreme precision. By mapping an external controller to the position of a looper's playhead, we can create a scrub function in just a few clicks. Now let's connect a second controller to the looper's playback speed. By default, the minimum and maximum values are -20 and 20, so let's choose more conventional values. We can now simultaneously control the position of the head and the playback speed. two new controllers allow us to select the begin point and duration of the loop. This allows us to move the looped area. In Granular, it is also possible to move the sample playback position using a controller. A second method would be to move the playback area. We haven't seen the users with push or MC devices here because we don't have any on hand. But if you have them, you'll see that you can easily configure and use them.